Welcome to our colleagues, students, guests, and especially our speaker, Dr. Luisa Prado Martins, as well as Dr. Alirio Karuna. Apologies, Alirio. So, as a point of housekeeping, I just want to mention that we do record the session for future educational use. And if there are any objections, please do write to us voicing these if you have any issues with us recording the session. The Spiral series is programmed by me, Dwayne Jethro, the Junior Research Fellow here at the Center for Curating the Archive, or the CCA. The CCA is located in the Michaelis School of Fine Art at the University of Cape Town. I'm assisted by Nina Liebenberg, a PhD candidate here at the center, who's also our co-host of the session. Nina, do you just want to wave quickly? Awesome. The CCA has worked actively with different kinds of collections to develop curatorship as a creative site of knowledge production. Archival and curatorial practice are core research activities of our work, both to conserve collections and for making them accessible to artists, scholars, and students. Projects, publications, and courses run through the CCA aim to open up novel combinations of the historically separated domains of the creative arts and the truth-claiming discourses of history and the social and natural sciences. The series draws on the CCA's long-standing interest in the nature of archive and its intersections with the curatorial as a programmed set of conversations about conceptions, configurations, and representations of art, the curatorial, and the archival. The title Spirals is as peculiar as it is purposeful. Peculiar because it is a metaphor of fierce, perhaps even destructive circulation. Purposeful in that it is the possibilities of disorder, but also renewal presented by such a metaphor that we find especially productive. The spiral, therefore, provides the possibility for conceptually sweeping across the linearities that structure our basic assumptions about archive, art, the academy, and the curatorial. As a space of circulation, these conversations are a site of sharing perspectives on crucial yet common questions about the nature of archive and the practice and work of the curatorial. We convene in virtual space between Berlin and Cape Town, and today between Copenhagen and Cape Town. This has been made possible in part due to the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic that has upended our world, upended our personal lives, our relationships, our professional worlds. It is important to stress that we want to abandon with the assumption about our speakers conveying lessons, as if the scholarly, artistic, and curatorial work being done in Berlin is at the vanguard that those in the global south should passively absorb. Certainly, Berlin is a major global hub of artistic and scholarly work, but in many ways, so too is Cape Town, South Africa, and the African continent more generally. These conversations are meant to enrich our perspectives here at the University of Cape Town and to challenge those of our speakers to contribute to them thinking differently. We therefore meet as a community of learning with different views brought to bear on a shared set of questions about the nature of archive, artistic practice, and the curatorial, the investments that attach to those. We are excited to host Dr. Luisa Prado de O. Martins. Dr. Martins is an artist, writer, and researcher whose work examines themes around fertility, reproduction, coloniality, gender, and race. Her doctoral dissertation approaches the control over fertility and reproduction as a foundational biopolitical gesture for the establishment of the colonial / modern gender system, theorizing the emergence of techno-ecologies of birth control as a framework for observing and resisting, disrupting, troubling colonial domination. Her ongoing artistic research project, A Topography of Excess, looks into encounters between human and plant beings within the context of herbalist reproductive medicine, approaching these practices as expressions of radical care. Since 2019, she has been developing a body of work that offers a critique of the racist concept of overpopulation in the context of the climate crisis, the current climate crisis, as part of a Willem Flusser residency with the project, The Councils of the Pluriversal, Affective Temporalities of Reproduction and the Climate Crisis. She's part of the curatorial board of Transmediale 2021, is a lecturer at the Institute for Art in Context at the University of the Arts in Berlin, and an assistant professor and vice director of the Center for Other Worlds at the Lusofona University in Lisbon. She's a founding member of Decolonizing Design. And Luisa, we are very honored to have you here today in our session. Many thanks for your time today and for coming to speak to us. Her talk is titled On the Colonial Histories of Color. In it, Dr. Martins reflects on the fascinating series of essays she's writing for the magazine, the online magazine Futuras, exploring the colonial histories that attach to a set of vegetal and mineral-based colors. She's currently writing for Futuras magazine. And I've provided a link for access to the articles in the notice that I circulated. Building on Martin's ongoing series, the session explores what the unearthing of the problematic and enduring histories of extraction and exploitation that certain colors reference, and their continued deployment as shades and palettes in a variety of creative media may mean for things as archival trace, art histories as material histories in the broad sense, and the potential of transdisciplinary aesthetic research today. We are delighted to have Dr. Alirio Carina as our discussant. They are a postdoctoral research fellow at the Archive and Public Culture Research Initiative. Dr. Carina is a scholar of African and Black social and political thought. Their teaching and research engages the fields of feminist studies, museum studies, anthropology, literature, history, political economy, and post-colonial philosophy. I hope I got it all in there. Colleagues, students, friends, Zoom fatigue is weighing on all of us. So we would like to keep the tone casual, easy, and accessible. It is Friday. It is the end of the month. So let's keep it light and engaging. Please keep cameras turned off during the presentation. Please raise hands for questions or post them in the chat box for us to gather. It would be great if you identified yourself when on screen. So many thanks to you, Luisa, for joining us here this afternoon. I now open up the virtual stage to you.
Thank you. I think I'm going to start by sharing my screen here. Just a second. It's always a little bit of a moment when we start this. There we go. Are you seeing the screen?
Yep. Yes, I can see it.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm gonna do this so we can all see. Is that good? Okay.
Yes,
so,
it works.
Great. First of all, thank you, Duane, for the invitation. It is a great honor to be talking here and to have the opportunity to discuss and reflect a little bit further on this series, which has been so interesting to write. Thank you, Alirio, for also being here, for responding and participating, and Nina also for helping organize. So I think I want to start by talking a little bit about how this series came about. The idea for this first came from my very good friend and editor of Futurist magazine, Nina Paim. We've known each other for years, and Nina had recently, and this was last year? Yeah, last summer actually, summer of 2020. I've been having trouble remembering things or figuring out what happened in 2020 because it feels like the year was lost. I always kind of forget. But yeah, anyway, in the summer of 2020, Nina came up to me, and she was about to launch Future S as a platform, as a magazine. And she invited me to talk a little bit about, or to develop this series where we talk a little bit about the colonial history of colors. And she first suggested this knowing of my work with plants, how long I had been working in my artistic practice with plants. And it was a very interesting proposal when I heard it. I wasn't really sure if I could really pull it off. This idea of looking into plants and their relationship with colors and colonial history, but at the same time, at that point, I had been researching the movement of plants in relation to colonial patterns and colonial routes and so on. So I thought it could be an interesting exercise and an interesting challenge. And we agreed that the first 3 parts of the series would focus on the 3 colors that, as design students, both Nina and I studied design in Rio, that as design students were taught to, even in Brazil, to associate with the Bauhaus and associate with a particular approach to design and to the use of color, which are red, yellow, and blue. And it was, I mean, we came to this agreement, but all else was pretty free. I was pretty much free to write whatever I wanted and to take whatever approach I found interesting. So I went into it, and I decided that the first, as I started thinking about it, I decided that the first one had to be read. The first one in the series had to be read. And I had a quite a neat little plan for this text. First of all, in this first text to introduce the series, I start talking about, or I started reflecting on plants and the languages that they speak. One thing that I've learned, I guess, in the past few years, as I have been engaging with plants from this perspective that takes into account coloniality and colonial structures of power, is that even the presence or the non-presence of a plant in a given place is significant. The things that we know, the things that we see, the things that are around us, or the beings that are around us, are so significant and can tell us so much about the story of a place and the processes that that led us to a particular situation. So I started this this journey in looking at the colonial history of colors with this plan to talk about red. And why did I choose red? I think now I can start telling you a little bit of the story of the place where I come from, the land that I come from, which is currently known as Brazil. So as I said, the structures of power that shape our contemporary world cannot really be disassociated with the circulation of botanic material that characterized the early colonial period. That is clear in so many different things. I mean, from the use of, for instance, cinchona species of plants to develop a cure for malaria, a treatment for malaria that was fundamental for, which is, by the way, a knowledge that Spanish colonizers extracted and exploited and appropriated from Quechua peoples in the Andean regions of South America, or Abya, as I and others like to refer to the continent. But in the Andean regions of Abya, the Spanish colonizers took over this knowledge and used it as a way to, for instance, further their reach within West Africa, where malaria was a problem for them. And so, I mean, when you start looking into it, there's so many histories or so many ways in which this circulation of botanic material and of herbal knowledges, herbalist knowledges, has been key in shaping these historical processes. So looking back and going back to the conversation around why I chose red after this detour, perhaps I want to start with this as a storytelling almost. I feel that all of this is very much storytelling. So, as I said, as the Portuguese invaded the shores of Abya, of the place currently known as the South American continent, they encountered a green, lush environment, particularly in the region where I come from, the region of the city of Rio. There was a particular type of plant that covered the biome of Mata Atlântica. I don't even know the name in English for this, but it's a particular type of biome that is present along the coast of Brazil. In this biome that covered such a significant part of the tropical coast, of this eastern tropical coast of Abya, there was a particular tree, a tree that is known to be so tall. And I can imagine at the time, this is an exercise in imagination too. I can imagine, or I try to imagine, what that place looked like, what the place where I grew up looked like at that time. The place that is so familiar to me, but that was completely different. The place where I grew up is a place that was shaped by these forces that arrived at that time. This plant, this tall tree, was classified by these settlers within Linnaean classification systems as Pseudopenia echinata. This tree has a spiky trunk, and as a young plant, and then as the tree grows older, its exterior starts acquiring kind of a scaly, its trunk starts acquiring kind of a scaly aspect. And it is quite a beautiful plant. It has all these kind of delicate pinnate leaves. It's a particular type of leaf that you can see here. It has these very beautiful, delicate pinnate leaves. It has these bright yellow and red flowers, or inflorescences, because it's a particular type of formation too. In indigenous languages, it had many names: Ibirapitanga, Ibirapitá, Arabutan, Orabutan. And what attracted, or what caught the attention of the Portuguese settlers was actually its wood. It has a striking red and orange, kind of reddish orange color. And its trunk features branches that kind of rise in the midst of this lush forest, this lush biome, almost like flames, because it's so red. And indeed, one of the indigenous names for this plant, Ibirapitanga, means red tree. And when I say that this is an exercise in imagination, is I can't help, as I started writing this, as I started researching this, I couldn't help but imagine this tall, imposing tree rising with its flaming trunk in the middle of all those lush greens of the tropical rainforest in those regions of Brazil. And indeed, even at the time of the Portuguese invasion, the ink extracted by indigenous peoples extracted already an ink from the core of the trunk to dye, for instance, feather ornaments. And the wood itself was utilized for bows and arrows. And of course, red, oh, and here is a picture of a part of the trunk. You can see how red it is at some point. And also, I think it's significant to mention that the trees have like different parts, even within the trunk. The inner part of the trunk is the part with the most intense red pigment. And that led me to thinking about this and thinking about the Portuguese becoming interested in this tree, this plant that had been used by indigenous peoples to produce artifacts and to dye ornaments and so on. It led me to reflect on the very meaning of the color red, right? In the early colonial period, when these European empires were trying to establish their hegemony over one another through the invasion and pillaging and exploitation of these lands that they claimed as their own, this tree, like many other botanic specimens, had a potential to become a valuable economic asset precisely because it offered, or this red pigment can be extracted from it. Thinking about the significance of the color red, I mean, we can think about the robes of Catholic cardinals, for instance, that are meant to reference the blood of Christ, or the velvets, the red velvets worn by royalty, a sign of wealth. Or there's so many instances where red is a color that becomes so associated with the high strata of European power. And actually, a similar plant, a plant from the same family, the same Caesalpinia family, but Caesalpinia sapan, had long been used to produce a red lac, which is an organic pigment used in painting during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, as well as manufacturing these luxury red textiles that European nobility and religious figures prized so much. But the issue was that this tree, sapanwood, as it was known, was native to tropical areas of Asia, where colonial domination hadn't been yet firmly established, not in quite the same way that it was being established in South America. And so after this invasion of Abya by the Portuguese, when they noticed this tree and they realized what it could be used for, Caesalpinia echinata, this plant, became a significant source for the extraction of red lac. To produce the pigment, the trees had first to be chopped down close to the roots. And then the trunks were peeled, separating the yellowish white wood that you see here outside from the red core. And during the first phase of exploitation of European occupied Abya Yala, this labor was undertaken by indigenous peoples who were enslaved by the Portuguese. After 1549, when the first slave ship arrived at the coasts claimed by the Portuguese, the trade of this tree of Cisalpina equinata was already an established foundation of the colonial economy. And indeed, it is the exploitation of these forests, of these trees, that provided the wealth that propelled then further colonial expansion inland, and ultimately allowed for the establishment of the sugar trade, which is the second phase of the colonial economy in the land known currently as well. And this is also significant to mention. The wealth provided by the exploitation of this tree also financed the participation of the Portuguese in the transatlantic slave trade. So all these ships and the chopping down of these red trees, I mean, this is, thinking about red, obviously we are drawn to the image of blood, and this is also something I can't help but visualize when I think about this history that is obviously a history of, I don't know, I think it's when we talk about histories of colonization, and I'm very aware that I am talking to you in South Africa and that you know that very, very well. But sometimes when I'm in Europe, when I'm in Europe, I feel that sometimes people don't really understand or don't really grasp the deep implications of it, and the fact that that we're talking about is an open wound, right? It's not a finished history. It's not something that can be forgotten or left behind. But thinking of this, I cannot help but think of these ships filled with red logs crossing the Atlantic, to Portugal, where the wood would be processed. And the processing, what was made from the processing of this wood, from this pigment, this red lac pigment that that was extracted from this plant. What came about? What artifacts do we still have? What artifacts or what all good?
Yeah, all good.
Okay, sorry. But yeah, thinking about this, thinking about the commerce of this plant and how significant it was for the economy in Portuguese occupied Abya Yala in the 16th and early 17th centuries. I think it's also important to perhaps locate this in time. This plant became the centerpiece of a monopoly, a very lucrative monopoly for the Portuguese crown. So this pigment is such a testimony to the impact of coloniality and how it shapes the contemporary world. And to this day, there are, of course, artifacts that, and artworks too, that remind us of this history. Perhaps many, I would say, don't see this, but I think this is a history that, or with this work, I hope to also remind or to encourage a reflection on this history and its ongoing sorry, its ongoing nature. This painting here that you're seeing now is Saint Cecilia, painted in the early 1620s by Pietro da Cortona, and this is currently part of the collection at the National Gallery in London. The red that you see in her skirt is a red lac extracted by from this plant, from Caesalpinia echinata. And very interestingly also, Saint Cecilia was a Roman martyr, which, and this to me was a very interesting I guess, parallel to reflect on. Saint Cecilia was a Roman martyr known for converting her pagan husband to Christianity. And the fact that the red in her skirt, painted with this pigment that has history so deeply linked to the occupation of land, to the acculturation and genocide of indigenous and African peoples, and the imposition of Christianity that was key to all of this process. I mean, this is such a to me, it's one of those things that takes your breath away when you see it, when you realize everything that is kind of encapsulated in this single painting. And yet, this is a history. I mean, this is a symbolism that is perhaps so obvious, right? And yet, it's not the only symbolism, or it's not the only thread that connects this early colonial history of Brazil with a narrative, with honestly a bloody narrative. By the mid 1600s, so not many years after this painting was made, the number of specimens of this plant in the Atlantic forest regions of Brazil had declined dramatically. Only during the first century of colonization, it is estimated that about 2 million trees might have been cut in this commerce. The plant is right now an endangered species. And this is why I said in the beginning that even imagining the forest full of these plants is an exercise in imagination for me. So with these diminishing amounts of raw matter available, the Portuguese settlers shifted their extractive activities. And remember, I mentioned that the second cycle of the colonial economy in Brazil was sugarcane. And this is why that happened. From the moment that this resource, so-called resource, had been exhausted, they shifted to something else. It was sugarcane. Then after that, it was coffee. Then cotton too, but to a lesser extent, not as much as in North America. And in spite of that, in spite of all these shifts, in spite of how this plant was exploited to a point that it became endangered, a very common plant became endangered, the name given to this plant is still imprinted for much of the world upon this stretch of land claimed by the Portuguese. the land that extends from the Amazon forest to the Pampas plains in South America. Brazil. Caesalpinia equinata was the first classification given by Europeans, as I said, to this flaming tree. But later it was changed to Brasilia equinata. And this is because the first name that the Portuguese gave to this plant was Pau Brasil, in reference, Pau is Brazilwood is its name in English. The name, as I said, is supposed to come from the word brasa, which is Portuguese for flame. Brazil, it follows, is an adjective that refers to that which is relative to the flame. A comparison that to me is so apt. And this is kind of an overview of the text about the red color. I'm gonna go a little bit faster through the next ones to leave us a little bit of time, but for a discussion, of course. But I wanted to start the overview or start talking about this particular plant because to me, this first text is kind of an origin story for all the series. Thinking about, thinking about Nina's first challenge or proposal to reflect on the colonial history of color, what I started doing here is to just, I felt that it was just like pulling a little thread that unraveled and unraveled and unraveled and unraveled. And I had, of course, growing up in Brazil, I had heard about the story of the tree and the tree that gave name to the country. But reflecting on it and actually tracing its presence, seeing the magnitude of the impact that this had both on the biome of Brazil and of these lands, and the human cost of this, of the exploitation of this so-called resource. I think it gave me a whole particular energy to go through the rest of the series. The second text it was kind of prompted by a trip that I did in 2018 to the Azores for work. In this trip, I was very interested in the location of the Azores, kind of in the middle of the Atlantic. And blue was obviously when you're like in a small island in the middle of small volcanic islands in the middle of the Atlantic, blue is a color that is very present in the everyday. Under the sun, around you, knowing that for kilometers and kilometers around you, there's only that sea, that ocean, the ocean through which so many ships passed. And indeed, even Columbus stopped in the Azores. And here's where I started, I got interested, as I said, in the color blue during this trip, or in the significance of the color blue during this trip. And then I started kind of pulling the thread again for this text. First of all, I studied from Lisbon. This second text is a little bit of a travel text, I feel, instead of being one so centered in Brazil as the red text is. In this first text, I actually start by reflecting on this monument, this white monument. I think it's important to mention, white in many ways. This is a Padrão dos Descobrimentos. It's a monument in Lisbon to the so-called discoverers of Portugal. Vasco da Gama, I mean, all of the, it's known in English as the Monument of the Discoveries. And yeah, it's meant to celebrate the so-called Portuguese Age of Discovery, the early modern period where Portugal kind of expanded its power overseas through the invasion and pillage of lands. What's interesting to me is that this movement, this monument is framed by so much blue. This bloody monument is framed by so much blue around it. These white men are almost throwing themselves into the sea. This is right, you can't see it in the picture, but it is shaped, obviously the monument is shaped like a caravel, this you can see, but what is not visible in the picture here is that the monument is placed right by the sea, or by the mouth, kind of the mouth of the Tagus River that goes into the Atlantic. So thinking about this, thinking about, you know, there's such a, to me, there's so much hunger in this monument. Hunger to go and throw oneself towards this blue, this pursuing this horizon where the sky meets the ocean, for power and for domination, dreams of power and domination, or even better, not dreams, I would say hunger, a violent hunger for power and domination. In a monument that is meant to celebrate these men as heroic, as heroes and adventurers, but whose cuts in the deep blue and the sea and the sky at this edge of Europe have caused, I think, are so deeply connected to all the red and the blood that I was talking about in the first text. And I started from this monument in the blue text precisely to look at how across the Atlantic, halfway across this blue immensity of the Atlantic, there's these islands, the Azores. These islands, as I said, they are in a very interesting particular location. Christopher Columbus ran ashore there in one of the islands as he was returning from his first invasion of the Americas. And what's interesting in these islands, and that first kind of got me, was that the traces of colonization are so woven into the landscape of the Azores. A significant portion of the fauna and the flora is not native and was introduced to the islands as a result of the Portuguese expansion through the world. And this is the case for Isatis tinctoria, which is a flowering plant in the Brassicaceae family. It's the same family as broccoli, actually. The plant has these deep green leaves concentrated at the base of each stalk. I can show it to you here. And though the individual specimens are not super striking, fields of blooming Isatis are quite spectacular, and I've seen them in the Azores. Crowns of these like small yellow flowers that move with the wind. It's probably a plant that is native to Central Asia, and that was most likely introduced to Europe during the late prehistory period. It's more commonly known as woad, and it is a very hardy plant that can tolerate heat and water stress. It has a number of medicinal and culinary uses, but most significantly, it is a main ingredient in the production of indigo dye, the deep ultramarine blue so similar to the color of the waters of the Atlantic Ocean. Ancient Egyptians used woad to color the fabrics that would wrap the dead, accompanying them on the journey to the world beyond. Celtic and Germanic peoples used woad indigo to dye their hair and to make body paint for ritualistic purposes. And they also used the pigment and the stick and poke technique for tattoos, as described by Julius Caesar. And what's interesting to me is that woad, which was a key part of the economy of the Azores for the 15th and 16th centuries. But the history of indigo isn't strictly linked to that one plant, right? The pigment can be extracted from hundreds of different plant species. But the species that yields the most concentrated form of the pigment, which is Indigofera tinctoria, often called true indigo, has long been cultivated and used in South, Central, and East Asia. And what kind of got me while writing this text is that the stories of both plants have once again become intertwined by the colonial trade routes that cut through lands and oceans. So woad played a fundamental role in the settlement process of the Azores. It was an anchor that kind of sustained this Portuguese outpost in the Atlantic, an outpost that was used for ships that traveled back and forth to and from Europe and the Americas. It was used as an outpost for ships to replenish in water, food, and so on. And unlike other Portuguese colonies, the Azores were never really a plantation economy, perhaps precisely because the environment didn't really allow for the establishment of monoculture on a large scale. So cash crops like sugarcane and coffee didn't really do well in the islands. But yeah, the role of the islands was to be a transportation route, and the export of the dye was also connected to that, and it was exported primarily to Flanders. So this plant, the dye produced with this plant, traveled through the same routes of these ships that went back and forth between Europe and the Americas. And nevertheless, that's also interesting, that the exploitation or the exploration of the Atlantic would also indirectly lead to the demise of the woad economy in the Azores and to the general decline of the use of this pigment throughout Europe. I mentioned before Indigofera tinctoria, known as true indigo. True indigo had been known in Europe for a long time, but with the establishment of trade routes to South Asia. And although it is cheaper to produce than woad, going through the land route and the disputed regions around the Mediterranean and Arabian Peninsula made the import of true indigo from South Asia a pretty risky endeavor. But this changed with Portuguese colonist Vasco da Gama, who managed to circumnavigate the African continent in 1497. And here we have a very clear link also to South Africa, right? And this route established a direct maritime, a direct sea route between Europe and South Asia. And this allowed for the explosion of commerce between the two continents and made the price of true indigo drop, which led to the decline of woad in the Azores in the 16th century. And then throughout the 17th century, the production of this blue dye of indigo shifted further away from Europe, with true indigo being cultivated in Caribbean, North, and Central American colonies. And by the second half of the 18th century, indigo had become a major crop in the plantation economy of South Carolina and to a lesser extent of Georgia, which of course we can think of. That was an economic explosion sustained by the exploitation of the labor and skill of enslaved Native and African peoples. And most of the output, most of this dye would travel across the ocean, feeding the flourishing British textile production during the early Industrial Revolution. The shifts, the profound shifts and the accelerating pace in global trade networks and economic models triggered by the Industrial Revolution would also ultimately, if we think about it, shape the history of the pigment throughout the 20th century. From indigo denim, which is something we all know nowadays, and the chambray fabrics that enveloped the bodies of factory workers and gave rise even to the term blue collar as a descriptor to the working class, to the popularization of blue jeans in the 50s by US pop culture, to also its subsequent association with Western capitalism during the Cold War. And here I think we can still go to the yellow.
I think we're almost out of time. Do we say we still want to make some time for discussion?
Yeah.
If you
mean,
if you want to
so much.
go through
go
yellow, I think for me the most interesting thing about the color yellow is the association with khaki. You highlight the extraction of the color yellow and it's so significant. You're wearing a beret that's very similar to to the khaki color, and in South Africa we know these associations between military dominance, the use of khaki, especially through the British Empire as well. So we know it quite well. But if you just briefly, like 1 minute, if you want to say what it's about and maybe what's coming up next in the series in terms of what color you're thinking of now.
Yeah. So very, very quickly, I started with the yellow text. I started with something that is kind of a pet peeve of mine, that I think I must have first noticed this when I watched that honestly terrible movie Traffic that won an Oscar, I don't know how many years ago. In that movie, Mexico, there was a part that was in Mexico, and it was always yellow. Every time that the scene cut to Mexico, it was yellow. And then years later, and that bothered me. I was like, what? And it was a kind of ugly yellow tint. And it was also such a stereotypical vision of Mexico and Latin America that I couldn't handle that. And then years later, I was watching Breaking Bad. I have a lot of opinions on Breaking Bad, but not all of them very good. But I was watching Breaking Bad, and again, that damn yellow tinge in the scenes. And I was like, why? Why from the moment that you cross the border, everything becomes yellow? This is another screenshot from a Netflix movie released not long ago called Extraction, that takes place in South Asia, and in Bangladesh specifically. And again, that damn yellow. This movie is from 2020. Same thing with that horrendous series, Homeland. Every time they were in the Middle East, yellow. The scene is yellow. And in a way, I saw that yellow that became a shorthand for danger and for to depict violence and danger in the global South. And that was like a big pet peeve for me. And when I started looking into this for the yellow text, I also realized that most often these scenes and these depictions of yellow were set in situations where there was some kind of military presence or some kind of law enforcement presence. And then I started noticing, I started thinking about, you know, all these scenes of US American soldiers in khakis invading and bringing freedom to places in the global south, because that's always the narrative, right? And so this text kind of follows Maclura tinctoria, which is a plant used to make fustic, a yellow pigment that is used in the textile industry to produce military khakis. And I started kind of tracing that in relation to in relation to U.S. imperialism, and going a little bit more back in, going a little bit to the past, also looking into the origin of khaki uniforms in the British Army in occupied South Asia. So that's kind of the general idea of this text.
Awesome, thanks, Louisa. And do you want to say a little bit about the color that you're exploring at the moment? Like what's coming next in the series?
Next is gold, and this completely insane church altar that you're seeing here is in Brazil, actually, and this is all gold. This church, located in the city of Ouro Preto in Brazil. Ouro Preto means black gold, by the way. This church has 400 kilos of gold throughout. And yeah, 400 kilos of gold in this church. And it is insane. It looks insane. I was there once, and it is breathtaking in the worst kind of way. It's so absurd. And it is in a state of Brazil, Minas Gerais, that was whose economy centered around gold extraction, which is, of course, something that was done with enslaved labor. And so in this text, I kind of go through that and discuss that. This gold text is a lot about memory. This that you're seeing here, these gashes in the Amazon forest that you're seeing here are gashes caused by illegal gold mining, which is a massive problem right now, particularly with the Bolsonaro government, and how they're turning just a blind eye to companies that are invading indigenous land to extract gold from the region in a process that is highly, highly poisonous to waterways in a region that, I mean, that is based, or that a forest that grows around rivers and waterways, right? And also indigenous cultures that are fundamentally linked to also the presence of water and waterways. So yeah, it's a whole other rabbit hole.
Awesome, thanks, Louisa. I think gold is something that we can relate to very strongly in South Africa with our history of gold mining, and you're talking about illegal gold mining in the Amazon rainforest. I think it was last week, there was a case where we have illegal gold miners in South Africa also who explore abandoned corporate mines. They are referred to as zamazamas, which is ambivalent. It means to try your luck or to gamble. And so they explore these abandoned mines, sometimes getting lucky, and sometimes unfortunately losing their lives. And most recently, I think 20 miners were recovered from some of these mines. So these histories of extraction of resources, and then what I particularly like about your series is how you use the color, how the histories of color bleed into other histories. They bleed into art histories, and they bleed into material histories, and they trickle through all of these different histories in very particular ways. And that was so evocative, and I thought it was so important to have you here to speak to us about this really, really important intersectional histories. But now I want to open up the floor for Alirio, because I'm pretty sure Alirio has many more astute comments than mine. Thanks.
I don't know if they're more astute, Doyne, but I do have some comments. Louisa, thank you so much for this presentation and for your series on Future Us. It's such a really wonderful laying out of the relationships between the material histories that are easy to not think about, and also the kind of ideas of color and how they play in the world that are also easy to not think about, and just to treat color as though it's a natural thing in the world. And I would be curious to hear more about the consequence of this relationship for how we might think about the kind of art world today, and all of the ordinary places that colors appear, and how to think about the entanglement of those with the ongoing violences of the world. But also, and here maybe I'm being a little bit selfish, I want to push you into extending this history of colors that you've offered into maybe beginning to think out loud something like a theory of colors. And so I see you as having offered us color as operating on many levels. The first level is it's materially something to be obtained, to be produced, whether as a pigment or a dye, or and then the question is how. And here it's easy to think, as you've pointed to, of the environmental destructiveness of extraction, or the pollution caused by dye works and tanneries. Thinking contemporarily, we might think of the child labor in global mica production. In another way, we might think about the kind of revival of cobalt mining as something that is made possible by the desirability of cobalt blue for centuries to make prestige potteries, including Delft blue and Portuguese azulejo and the China white blue pottery. And so extraction is kind of a fact, and you've offered it to us as a fact. And it matters where in the world the extractive fact is situated, and the conditions of labor that mark it, and how they are and are not made visible. And here actually, something you said today made me think of this connection with the word exploração, which so easily means exploration and exploitation and extraction in this gift, the colonial language revealing something about the colonial project, right? It's all of these things in one. And then it feels that all of this is then marked or perhaps masked by maybe color itself, the kind of spectacularity of seeing color. And this is what I'm trying to suggest might be worth stepping into as a kind of theory. What is happening with color as a mediating form? How is the experience of color itself doing something to our ability to see the things that are making it? Especially now that these histories are so layered. Because then color is also something that's produced, as you point to us, something with associations that follow, that are sometimes intermeshing and sometimes overwriting each other, but maybe never quite entirely overwriting each other and maybe coexisting. And you point to this with indigo really beautifully. You know, woad becomes blue jeans. in a pivot that forgets woad and forgets indigo production during slavery, forgets histories of conquest, but never exactly entirely. And there's something that's there that is held on to. And so really thinking about how these different associations layer with each other, and whether there's something about the visual spectacle of color that encourages this, or that allows it in some contexts and maybe disables it in others. And here it feels like I'm thinking with partly what you've just mentioned with the filtering of yellow, right? Where the capacity of color to change what is already there by being placed on top of it, to invite us to combine our associations for two different things and to make a new thing in the process. But beyond the kind of cultural codedness, there's also, I keep returning to the idea of the spectacle, and I keep wanting to ask you to think with it. And one thing I'm thinking about here is, I was recently in California. Well, recently is not the right word. A year ago, I was in California during wildfire season, and the thing that was most noticeable for all of us, along with the ash on the floor, was the sunlight was the wrong color, and so everything was the wrong color, and the kind of change in lighting immediately changed the experience of the world, and how the kind of the encounter with color as something that isn't the normal, how that has a kind of consequence. This makes me think also, sometimes you see grass that looks too green, like it looks like it might have been painted green, and that immediately it's jarring in a way, and it does something, and it's a part of the power of color that isn't just about all of its associations, but that's also about habits and how we live in them. And this space of habit is really interesting to me. Especially because of how proliferated color is, right? Because everything is colored. Even the pieces of our everyday life that come from the natural world supposedly are colored. The cheap woods in this house that I'm in right now have been dyed to look like they're expensive woods. The cotton that you wear is bleached and then dyed some more. So there's so much attention to color everything in a kind of hyper consumeristic way in a bid for consumer attention, which also means that there's a space for colors to not necessarily mean so much. So on the one hand, they can be so layered with meaning, and on the other, they can be kind of collapsed of having meaning, and maybe collapsed of a way to access the histories that they have in those colors that we might want to hold on to. Which is a really strange series of reflections to offer you, I know. But I guess in light of them, what I want to ask you is how you understand what is shaping the kind of visual authority of color, like how it does things to how we encounter it, and how you feel that is playing with the material histories that bring it into being, and that it's always in kind of relationship with. Thank you.
Thank you. That's an amazing prompt, an amazing reflection. As you were speaking, I was thinking about some things, this idea of color, or this ability of color to collapse meaning that you talked about immediately took me to what I was talking about in the yellow text. I mean, places as different as Mexico, or places in Latin America and South Asia and Africa, and they're all shown as yellow because it is a uniform thing. It's just like this stereotypical kind of, it is a collapsing of meaning and nuance and all the things that are particular to a place, just to put it in a box that says underdeveloped, violent, dangerous, and that's all that there is to it, right? And that to me is, I think, what really, really bothered me. And I'm not the first one to talk about this, of course. There are other texts that already explore this question of the yellow filter, but I was interested in this text to go a little bit further and think about this also in relation to the military domination of particularly the United States in the 20th and 21st century. And the relationship between, this yellow filtering, the places that are filtered yellow are the places that are in need of international intervention from European powers, from the United States, from the northern Western nations, let's say. And what's interesting to me even as I look back into these texts is to reflect upon, how I see the Portuguese launching themselves into the sea through that monument that is still there in the year of our Lord 2021. They're still celebrating that, which blows my mind. And also, it's not surprising at the same time. But seeing that being celebrated as an accomplishment of a nation, and a celebration of violence and genocide and like all these things, and seeing those white men in white, shown in white, launching themselves into the blue of the sea in the direction. And that also, I think I forgot to mention, but that monument points, it's not on purpose, I guess, but it points towards the Azores. It's kind of pointed towards the Azores. And then you have, those islands halfway across the Atlantic that were these outposts for ships involved in the transatlantic slave trade. And then ships that perhaps went to Brazil and that were also connected to the exploitation of those trees. And I also love that you picked up on exploration and exploitation because I keep kind of mixing them up because it's the same word in Portuguese. But yeah, and I kept on wondering as I was writing the blue text, did those ships stop at the Azores? Maybe they did. And the idea that we have is to make this into a book, make this series into a book in the future. So hopefully I'll have a little bit more time to even try to look that up, because I'm sure there's so many kind of connecting threads. And then we think about like continuation of certain histories, with the abolishment of slavery in the American continent. In each country did it in a slightly different timeline, but with the abolishment of slavery in the American continent, then you have all of a sudden other forms of exploitation that take its place, and other forms of exploitation that create a particular social stratification, which leads to the emergence of the working class that is then wearing the blue, indigo, that's also known as blue collar. And so there is, all these histories that are so interconnected in these histories of color that are so fascinating to me. And I don't think I can come up yet with like a theory of color per se from what I have right now, but to me it's I was already very interested, as I said, in the circulation of botanic material and how that connects to colonial power. And for sure, exploring these colors through these plants, through the lenses of plants specifically, allowed me to expand that. And I think I also forgot to mention the next three will be minerals. So I will kind of shift the focus a little bit to look into minerals. Of course, you know, I showed the gases in the Amazon forest because that is also connected to a depletion of an exploitation of particular biomes, and even, you know, the fact that gold mining poisons waterways, that already causes a disaster in terms of deaths of trees and flora and fauna, and profoundly affects the livelihoods of entire indigenous groups. So yeah, to me, that's all those histories are so deeply connected, and I don't know, am I making sense? I'm just like kind of freestyling here and kind of reflecting, really.
No, you are absolutely making sense, Louisa, and those are really wonderful provocations as well. Thanks, Alida. I also wondered about the implications of, like, so how do we think about color today, considering these extractive histories that you've unearthed, and these extractive genealogies that you've unearthed. So shall we open up for some questions? I see Nikita, one of our students in the Honors in Curatorship course, has posed a question. Nikita, would you like to come up on stage and pose your question?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Cool. Hola. Thank you for sharing your work with us. Yeah, it's so layered, and I feel so encouraged to think about things that I'm fed in like a very not critical way, but a way where I'm asking more questions, even if I don't have the answers. So thank you for that. So I was just interested to know what you would say is the color of colonialism. What would you say is the color of colonialism? And like, are colors as a concept, is that part of colonialism or the colonial project? Because we're naming things, we're categorizing things. So yeah, I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
I mean, if I had to choose a color for colonialism, it would sure be white, right? It's gotta be. I mean, you know, I say it only half joking because, you know, with the colonial project, we have the imposition of a hierarchy of subjectivity that puts white Europeans at its top. So yeah, I mean, I said it kind of like in a cheeky way, but also for real. I think it would be, that would be what I would choose if I had to choose like a color as a symbol of colonialism. And in so many ways, I mean, even, I don't know, I'm in Scandinavia right now. And this is probably I'm probably going to be kicked out of the country for saying that, but even, you know, this whole like minimalism thing that is so centered around whiteness and white and the absence of certain things. I don't know, I have a problem with minimalism because I think it is very often rooted in or very often comes from a place of being able to choose not to have things and not to have certain things. And, you know, when people talk about minimalism as in you must only acquire goods that are high quality, not everybody has the money for that. Yeah, so I think it would definitely be white. Deborah is saying, yeah, the privilege of spaciousness, neatness. Oh my God, there's some stores here. I'm in the city center. There's some stores here that, my God, massive with nothing inside. Sorry, Dwayne, were you? I didn't hear you.
Oh no, I just mentioned that I was trying to think with you about white as the color of colonialism, and how you would develop that using a resource. But I imagine just having it as a lacuna in a collective text, just having the color unmarked or thinking about whiteness, because that's how whiteness operates. At least that's the way I would be thinking about it. Operates as a kind of invisible color. It's just it's
Absolutely.
so apparent that it's that it goes unseen. Some more questions. Oh no. Apologies, my signal broke up a little bit there. Can you hear me now?
Okay, yeah, I was struggling to. Yeah,
Apologies
now I can
apologies
hear. I
about
was
that.
struggling to hear you a little bit.
Luisa, in the absence of questions, so what do we do with to build on Alirio's provocation? What do we do with red? What do we do with blue? What do we do with gold now? How do we think about these colors, especially when they are used in classical works, the classical works that you cite in your series? How do we think about these classical works and the resources that were used to make them? Like, what do we think about those works now? What should we do with them? I was provoked to think about that, and especially by Alirio's comment as well.
I think it's, for me, writing this series, and you know, again, I'm speaking from my own kind of perspective. For me, it's a matter of really it's changed my perspective, I guess, on understanding not just the, you know, a work like the painting that I showed, or the monument that I showed too, or the series and movies and stuff that I mentioned. I think it's the exploration of these colors in this way has helped me contextualize that so much more. And for instance, now I mentioned the monument, right? The monument, which is white. But that is a monument that I think, you know, it was even made as white. In my personal interpretation, that monument is white precisely because white is understood as the norm. So therefore, making that monument white, it has no color. And yet, that monument is in a particular place. It is the blue that frames that monument. in another place, it would be something different. It wouldn't have, it would still be a celebration of these men, but it wouldn't have quite the same impact. And it is a massive place, you know, it is meant to cause an impact. And for me, although it is white, it is the blue that frames that monument. It is the blue that shows the full violence of that and points, the way that it points towards the blue is, and towards the ocean and the sky. That to me is what reveals so much. And then, you know, thinking about the red, I mean, if I saw that that painting, I wouldn't particularly think about that red part in it, you know. If I was in a National Gallery in London and I saw that painting, and I don't know, sometimes it's so serendipitous to do research. It's such a kind of a serendipitous process, because this, you know, it is a saint that was known, or that became a saint exactly because she converted people. She converted someone else. And how much of that, how incredible it is that this has such a connection to the history of the colonization of the Americas, and not only of the Americas, of course, so many other places too. Christianity was fundamental for that. And even, you know, again, I think about the robes also of cardinals and all of that, and how the power of the church is still so present. The power of the church, Catholic or otherwise, of Christianity in general, is still so present, and it is still such a colonizing force. I mean, I remember a story of a missionary in 2020 in the middle of the pandemic who tried to get into an island in the Indian Ocean to convert local peoples, particularly in a place that was uncontacted from the rest of the world. And in the middle of the pandemic, the guy tried to get in there. And if that doesn't say something about the genocidal project of that, then I don't know what does, you know, in the middle of a COVID pandemic. And then in the yellow text, I mean, I talked about it already, you know, this kind of flattening of so many different cultures, so many different people, so many different environments and contexts, and so on. And oh, there's a comment here. Yeah, Alirio. The monument even suggests a washed out blue because its face is styled, and azulejo is a reference for that in Portugal. Yeah, true. The reference to racial fantasy of white Greco-Roman sculpture. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I think there's, to me, this has kind of unearthed so much that I can't really unsee. And I think that's why this gold text that I'm working on, that should be done already, but I'm late. That's why the gold text that I'm working on, I'm also thinking about memory, I guess, because it's the process of writing these texts and thinking about this is bringing me back to so many different moments, you know, where I was confronted with that. And now is kind of a moment of reckoning of like, okay, you know, what do I make of this? What do I make of these things that now I see more clearly, and that I have kind of this new lens too? to observe it with. I don't really have any concrete answers. It's kind of an ongoing process, really.
I think that's that's the most important part, right? Like that it is open-ended, that it is a process that accommodates for, exactly as you said, for serendipity, for open-endedness, for new possibilities. So I want to say muito obrigado, Luisa. Thank you so much for your time. It was so stimulating to hear about your series. It's such a
Thank you.
fascinating series, and it just I thought it'd be absolutely amazing, and it was absolutely amazing to hear you speak about these yeah, these multiple histories that colors actually enfold, and how important it is. And it's not just your genealogies that you unfold, but it's the possibilities that you've created through your series for showing us how we can possibly think in our own ways about color. So there are possibilities for us to surface our own genealogies, South African genealogies of different vegetal colors and different mineral colors as well. So that was really inspiring. And also want to say thank you so much for Alirio, for thinking with us and for thinking with Luiza's work as well. Thank you so much. Muito obrigado as well, Alirio. Let's try and keep this conversation going in some way, and let's keep trying to exchange about histories of color and how they intersect ideas of art history, botany, minerals, and so on. So on that note, I want to say thank you again to Luisa, and thank you again to Nina also for assistance in organizing. Thank you to all of you who have attended today. And I want to signal that we'll have our next session on the 30th of July, Friday the 30th of July, with Dr. Hanin Hanouk. Do you know Hanin Hanouk, Luisa?
Hanin Anu? No, I don't think so.
Hanin Hanouk does work on the history of three-color photography in the German Empire in the late 19th and early 20th century. She
Ooh,
will
what a
talk
time.
about the relationship between the process and the invention of the process of three-color photography in printing and printing of three-color photographs, and how it bleeds into histories of botanical histories, the collection of human remains, as well as anatomical histories as well. So these interrelationships. So we continue with the theme of color in July, building on the wonderful inspiration that has been provided by Luisa. So Luisa, I want to also say much inspiration and strength, not only for the series, but also for your wonderful project that you're completing in Copenhagen. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Oh yeah, actually the opening is in an hour and a half, and it's I'm doing a project together with Edna Bonhomme, who also participated in the series already, and we're doing like a small exhibition together as part of a longer, ongoing research and artistic project here in Copenhagen with the Laboratory for Art and Aesthetics here in Denmark, and the and Aerial Feminisms, who is the institution who's hosting us here. So I'm going to be in this residency. I started kind of a research into the presence of a plant called Queen Anne's lace, that is used for contraceptive purposes in so many different places. And initially I was kind of obsessed with how did this knowledge travel to so many different places, and it's used in very similar ways. You know, the intake is very similar in like Appalachia, in India, you know, in so many different places. So yeah, I kind of started looking into that, then went into a whole thing about looking into not only how knowledge travels, but what how does that relate to ideas on identity and nationality and citizenship? Because there's a whole legend around the shape of the flower, because it looks like lace, and it's got like one red flower in the middle that is said to be the drop of blood from Queen Anne, who was making the lace. And this Queen Anne, it's not certain if it's Anne of Denmark or Anne of Britain, and who are related to, and the fact that this plant grows in so many different soils to me is super interesting. And I started looking into, when I said citizenship and so on, because Denmark has follows a law principle, a legal principle for nationality that is called jus sanguinis, which is you must have a Danish parent in order to be considered Danish. It doesn't matter if you are born here. And Germany had that for quite a long time, actually, and changed to jus solis, which is law of the soil, instead of blood law, which means if you are born in German territory, then you're German. I mean, I went through a bunch of rabbit holes for this, and yeah, I'm basically going to do a performance where I'm kind of splitting myself between two lace techniques and trying to make lace in two different ways. Brazilian lace from the region where my family comes from, and European lace.
Fantastic. I look forward to, I hope there's going to be a video of your performance. Otherwise, we'll make sure to capture a link for the exhibition in the write-up that we usually publish of the talk as well. So thank you so much to our audience. Thank you again, Alirio. Thank you, Luisa. We will see you all on the 30th of July for the next iteration of the series. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you.